Good evening. I'm Graham Allison. Let me do my most important assignment, which is to ask you to turn your Blackberries, phones, others off. I was asked to introduce this session tonight since I think I instigated it and managed to persuade Larry to sit for yet another interrogation on the question, how was Washington? How did you enjoy it? And what lessons from it might we apply here as faculty members or students thinking about government? So I think the main message tonight is Washington's loss is Harvard's gain. And the purpose tonight is to say welcome home, Larry. So let's say welcome. As I mentioned, after Larry's previous service in Washington, where, among others, eventually he was Secretary of the Treasury, where he would sign the dollar bills. We had a session in which he offered to faculty members and students thoughts about what did he had learned that had surprised him and what might be applied. And I think the opportunity to do that again tonight with David Gergen, who's very good at getting people to maybe go a little bit beyond their talking points is something that I look forward to. So I would say, as a citizen, I'm very grateful for Larry's service as President Obama's chief economic advisor over a period in which we, thanks to wise policy, did not see a second Great Depression. And as a colleague, I'm very proud to have him home.
Good evening. Thank you very much, and thank you, Graham, for making this possible. Yet another idea that Graham Allison has brought to fruition here at the Kennedy School. And I want to welcome all of you back to the most prestigious forum at this university, and with one of the most prestigious figures. Larry, thank you for joining us tonight. My hope is that over the course of the conversation, and we're going to leave ample time for questions at the end, that we can draw out some of these lessons, but let's jump right in. I want to ask you this question. The Deficit Commission came in with a proposal for $4 trillion in deficit reductions over the next 10 years. The Senate is now working in a small group to try to come up with a proposal. Paul Ryan, the Republican budget chief, today published a proposal for savings of some $6 trillion over 10 years. Is it time for the administration to come up with a proposal?
Certainly time for every responsible figure in government to be as constructive as they can about the deficit in the long term. It's not the time to slash spending immediately. We've still got 9% unemployment. Aggregate demand is coming from the private sector is not what it needs to be for the economy to grow and to create jobs. So no one should be rushing to cut government spending or to cut the deficit right now. At the same time, no one can look at the forecasts out 5 to 10 years and think that this is a situation that has any high probability of being stable. So I think there's no question that it's incumbent on everybody to do what they can to find a solution. It's really a political judgment, not an economic judgment, what the best way to do that is. And one of the things you learn when you go from the university to Washington is in the university, the idea is to figure out what the best policy is, and then you say the best policy, and then you try to persuade everybody else that it's the best policy, and you try to win the argument. In Washington, it's very different. Some of it's about what the best policy is, but everyone wants to feel that they have had an important impact on the policy. Everyone wants to show their constituents that they have pushed it in the right direction. And so even if you know exactly what the right compromise is at the end of that process. And even if you can figure it out, announcing it prematurely can doom it. If you build in the AARP's concessions on programs for people over 65 before the AARP has asked for them, then you have denied the AARP any opportunity to demonstrate its efficacy to its constituents, and therefore they are going to have to regard what you put forward as unacceptable. So I think it's a political judgment what the best way to be constructive is. And I think the very great difficulty, and it is hard to know where you are, is that being responsible given the complexity of the politics and not putting forward a plan that is more likely to constitute a basis for target practice than for followership, that may be the right thing to do, but it may also be what you do if you actually don't want to take the political risks associated with trying to solve the problem. And so it's very difficult to know. And so I can understand why many people express the concern that the president should show more leadership, but he will not have effectively led if he takes the viable compromise off the table. And the viable compromise put forward tomorrow in a frontal way from the president will all but require all kinds of people who might have accepted it reluctantly as the end of a process to denounce it. You know, I was always, when I'm in government, the professors are always in the same place. The professors always want to have a plan. They always want to lay out a plan. They want to lay it out in detail. If there's ever a choice between having a 5-page plan, a 5-page fact sheet, and a 30-page blueprint, the academics advising any president are always in favor of a 30-page blueprint. So I had very much that bias in each of the areas that we faced. But, you know, this president has, doing it his way, which is to talk about principles, to consult with others, not to have a cymbal and drums White House announcement, actually has been the most productive president legislatively, certainly in the last 40 years and perhaps in the last 70. So I think one has to credit the possibility that there's a wisdom in the approach that's being taken. And my impression is there's a lot of noise and a lot of heat, but there's also a lot of constructive dialogue underway. And the fact that 64 senators on a bipartisan basis have vowed to do something is, I think, quite constructive and something that might well not have happened if the president had put forth more detailed proposals with respect to a variety of the entitlements and with respect to a variety of the tax measures. If memory serves, you know, the most successful bit of tax policy legislation in the United States in the last 40 years was probably the Tax Reform Act of 1986. That began with the president saying that we were all going to discuss the issue for a year, and then the Secretary of the Treasury was going to produce a plan. The Secretary of the Treasury produced the plan with the famous sentence that it was written on a word processor.
Yeah.
The plan, after it had been written on a word processor, was then the basis for a lot of discussion and argument, and there was no new revised plan. It simply worked its way through the legislative process. So yes, history would have judged us badly if we had allowed the economy to fall into depression, and that was a real risk. And that now looks very unlikely. And perhaps the next thing that history can judge us on is, did we bequeath to the next generation a nation that was in reasonable condition with respect to deficits. Above all, financial budget deficits, deficits from deferred maintenance, deficits from inadequate infrastructure. Did we do what all future generations have done and provide for the future? And that question is as yet unanswered.
Let me kind of come at it a different way. Erskine Bowles, Alan Simpson, and the Deficit Commission argued that we should not cut spending immediately, but that there was urgency in laying in place legislatively a long-term plan, and to do it quickly within the next couple of years that would kick in as the economy grew in strength. Your friend and colleague Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart have been arguing the case about urgency. Is there an urgency to getting these entitlements and to get tax policy and defense policy under better control over the next 2 years, or is this something that you think the economy could safely leave till after this presidential election?
I think that you are living with less risk if you are living with a sound financial framework, and that we do not have such a sound financial framework in place, and therefore prudent risk management, maximally prudent risk management, would involve laying out an approach, perhaps an approach with contingencies that would bring us forward on a more balance towards a much more sustainable budget path. But I don't think, so it's the right thing to do. On the other hand, and one I would strongly support, on the other hand, I don't subscribe to the sky is falling school here. The United States' financial position is profoundly different, contrary to some political rhetoric you're starting to hear from that of the European countries that are in serious trouble. We are a decade plus away from being where Japan is, and long-term interest rates in Japan are still below 2%. Now, our situation is different in a whole set of ways than theirs, and perhaps the most important thing that people should always know about deficits is you can listen to the debate in Washington and you can think that somehow there are three things you can do if you want to spend money, or that they're sort of, you can finance stuff with taxes, you can finance stuff with cutting spending, and you can finance stuff by borrowing. And the reality is that financing stuff by borrowing isn't an alternative to the other two. It's a way of deferring the pain associated with the other two. So should we be in a different place? Yes. Will the sky fall if we don't get to that place over the next decade? Yes. Will the sky fall in the next 2 years if we don't get to that place? It's certainly possible, but it wouldn't be what I would predict.
You've managed to express your preferences while also avoiding headlines. It's very deft.
David, the first experience that I had in Washington was working for Marty Feldstein, who's here tonight, during the Reagan administration, at which time, if memory serves, you served as the White House Communications Director, and I watched you very carefully. And I learned a great deal during that time. I have not.
You can leave it there.
I have not always been. I've not always been successful in every position I've held at every moment in avoiding statements that would make headlines. However, so perhaps painful experience has on occasion been instructive.
Terrific. Larry, as you look back over that, when you came in, I think you and your colleagues advised the president that there was a 1 in 3 chance of a depression during the transition period. And you look back at what you all accomplished during that period, going back to Graham's point, avoiding a Great Depression. And yet there were a lot of other people who thought money was wasted on bailouts and that sort of thing. People got this exaggerated sense of how much this cost the government. How do you, as you look back upon it, what did you do right? What would you have done differently?
I think the president made the right core choices. The president made the judgment that it was better to err on the side of doing too much than to err on the side of doing too little. He made the judgment that this was the kind of thing that happens 2 or 3 times a century, where you fundamentally cannot rely on the self-stabilizing forces of the market, that you don't know exactly what the key steps in the process are, therefore you're better off intervening at all of them and hope that you get some traction. And that's why the judgment to engage in substantial fiscal expansion, I believe, was a correct one. That's why a judgment to support financial institutions and eliminate the sense that the major financial institutions in the country could fail and could fail with their creditors at any instant. That's why a judgment that probably would not have been the right judgment in normal times, that a bankruptcy was appropriate for the automobile companies, but not a bankruptcy with liquidation of those companies rather than restructuring of those companies. And that's why a judgment to provide substantial support to the remainder of the global economy and to urge others in the global economy in the direction of expansion was appropriate. I think those four core steps were essential. There'll be debates as to what their relative importance was. One of the judgments that the President and Secretary Geithner made that history will record as the right judgment that would not have reflected the prevailing wisdom among much of the outside expert community was the decision to do stress tests, to talk about private capital raising, and not to nationalize the banks. That was a judgment that reflected a recognition about the importance of confidence, and it was also a reflection of what is a very important principle in policy making, which is you don't jump to the radical step. None of us could have known with certainty that those banks were going to be able to make it, even with the support that was provided. But the act of nationalizing those banks would have been an act that would have been fraught with consequences for a very, very long time. And so playing to avoid it was the right first move, and it was a move that fortunately proved to be successful. So I think that the broad judgments were made correctly. Could battlefield medicine is never perfect. I think we hoped and expected to be more successful in addressing the problems in the housing market than we were. I think there are legitimate questions that can be asked about the size of the fiscal expansion. We were more optimistic that if the economy stayed depressed, it would be possible to go to Congress to get further fiscal expansion than in fact proved.
You thought you could go back for stimulus too if you needed to.
We thought that we comforted ourselves. I mean, those of us on the economic team favored more stimulus than the president requested, and the president only got through the Congress 80% of the stimulus that he requested. And we comforted ourselves in part with the thought that if more was needed, we would be able to go back and get more.
So had you known you couldn't get more, would you have had a bigger stimulus to start?
Well, I mean, the economists, as I said, already favored a larger stimulus, and so in a way, the question was a little moot. We were not worried that there was any substantial chance that we would get too much stimulus. And so the president was going politically for as much as he could get, so I don't know that there's anything very different we could have done if we had understood that a year later, if we had understood how the political dynamics were going to play out. But that was not something that we judged. That was something that, in retrospect, I at least didn't judge.
Do you feel that, in retrospect, too, that there was certainly the business community felt that there was a growing hostility between the administration, the White House, and the investment banks and others. And Bob Rubin would argue that that actually had a psychological impact upon the recovery itself, delayed and dampened the spirits coming into this year.
I'm of two minds about that, David. A part of me feels, as I used to say every 2 or 3 days in the White House, that confidence is the cheapest form of stimulus, and that it was important to do as much as one could to provide stimulus, and the diverse and disparate agendas of a new progressive administration all raining down on business, combined with rhetoric that picked up some of the public mood, may have had some surely had some adverse impact on the psychology in some quarters, and may have had some adverse impact on investment. So that's an argument that I made and reflected and feel with some force. The other side of it, though, I think makes 2 points, both of which I also think have some force. One is, if you actually look at the facts, the last 2 years saw the best performance of corporate profits since the Second World War, and the best performance of the stock market since the Second World War. So however people were feeling, what was actually happening was pretty good from their point of view. And while it's a more technical matter, that wasn't all because they were down in the floor. There was a bunch of it was even if you look at profits relative to 2007 profits, they're pretty good right now. The other point is, and this is something the president said to CEO groups who didn't much like hearing it, but it was true. He said, "I am what's standing between you and the people with pitchforks." And,
You're right, they didn't like it.
They didn't like hearing that at all, but it was true. I mean, the House of Representatives did pass legislation that would have essentially expropriated. For the first time, America had passed literally an expropriation tax bill. Essentially all the bonuses of the people at AIG. Now, passions cooled. We worked that, and the legislation didn't move forward in the Senate. But one of the things that I've learned in my time in Washington is there's a lot of truth in the architectural maxim that buildings that sway don't break, and don't topple, and buildings that are completely rigid are more likely to topple. And so I think that there was a tremendous amount of people in business who blamed the president for what they were experiencing from the public, when the president was actually picking up what was coming from the public in a rather muted way. But in retrospect, are there things one might have done that would have shown empathy with the public in ways that might have been less costly in terms of investment? I think that's a reasonable question to go back and review. But again, you would be hard pressed to find a Democratic administration going back to John Kennedy and the steel prices, when in its first 2 years, the business community wasn't outraged about how they didn't understand and they didn't get it. Right. And you'd also be hard-pressed to find a Democratic administration when life didn't actually work out pretty well for business relative to how it has on average.
One of your many responsibilities you're taking up is to working with John Haig to run the Center for Business and Government here. So I'd like to ask you briefly about business. The hostility toward business within the public is still very intense. As I travel the country, I hear a lot of people argue, first the business elites, made a ton of money, and they did it in part by shipping our jobs overseas. Then they came along and manipulated the markets and brought on this deep recession, manipulated housing, manipulated a lot of stocks, and then and now they're making more money. And now because of the resulting deficits from all of this, now they want to pay for the deficits not by paying more taxes, but by crushing and taking money away from seniors and from children. What is your advice to the business community now about this growing gap that exists between the elites and others?
I actually think that when I ask myself what I worry about with respect to the United States in 2030, some people worry about the deficit and the accumulation of debt. Some people worry about the rising China and what it will do to us. I think I worry most about what increased inequality and reduced opportunity will do to the legitimacy of our system. There is something deeply troubling about the fact that even after the economy recovers, 1 in 6 men in the United States between 25 and 54 will not be working. If one looks at what has happened to the top 1% relative to the next 99%, what has happened to the top 1% of the top 1% relative to the top 1%, the figures are have to be deeply disturbing, and it comes along with, and I think this is a very important part of it, that probably and the statistics aren't entirely clear on this, but probably for the first time in American history, over the last generation, the gap in the life prospects between the children of the well-off and the children of the less well-off has widened. So I think it's going to be incumbent on the business community to reassure their public that they are citizens of the United States as well as citizens of Davos, that there is a stake in what happens in the United States. I think there is going to be a need to re-legitimize public institutions, starting from the public schools. And I think we have to hope, because it's not something that public policy can sensibly control, we have to hope that the workings of the market system will, over time, operate to provide more reinforcement to the incomes of people in the middle relative to the incomes of people at the top. And we need to do more to provide security. I actually think over time, there are no certainties about this, and all kinds of things could go wrong. But I actually think the knowledge that you can't lose your health insurance because you or somebody in your family gets sick, which is something that happens for at least a few months to nearly a third of Americans in a 5-year period, I actually think that over time is the kind of thing that can make a substantial difference. But I don't think we have a great set of answers to these questions. I'm not one who believes that You can have a lot of successful employees without a lot of successful employers. And I'm not one who believes that you can mandate and cap the ways in which business compensation works, nor am I one who believes that business should move away from the idea of focusing on shareholders and trying to maximize profits, because I think that too would come with substantial costs. But I think the business community will need to recognize more than many of its members do that their long-run success depends upon the success of the broader society, and that working to push the tax system in a more regressive direction may not be constructive from that point of view.
Do we face deeper structural problems than perhaps we have understood in the past? You wrote, before you went into government, you wrote frequently about the anxious middle. This is an issue that's been very present in your thinking and your writings. I was struck by Ed Luce from the Financial Times, paid a visit to you last week. I talked with him, writing a book about the future of jobs in this country. Didn't see what the answers were. It was very unclear what the answers were. There's a new book by Tyler Cowen called The Great Stagnation. It was reviewed in the Financial Times yesterday, and it was called the most discussed book of the year, most discussed economics book of the year, and argues that we've hit a plateau on technological breakthroughs in terms of creating jobs. The reviewer said that's not the problem. We have excess technology, not too little technology. How should the middle class think about the future of jobs and whether they're going to be there in this country?
I think there'll be jobs. The question is whether there'll be jobs that people want and that are attractive in the way that jobs have been there in the past. It's instructive and sobering to look at all the consumer price indices. You know, we think about the consumer price index overall, but if you look at the consumer price index product by product, and you look at them where they're all 100 in 1980 or sometime in the 1970s, and then you look at them today, the one for television sets is at 10, and the one for healthcare is at 700. And so if you look, you have seen a very profound set of changes in relative prices. And that's got to do with the fact that manufacturing is basically going through a set of transformations very much like agriculture did. There's only so much of the stuff people want, and you get more and more efficient producing it, and you just don't need that many people to produce it. Already in the United States, only 5% of workers are production workers in manufacturing. The number you usually hear is 10% of employment in manufacturing, but that includes the financial people and the administrative assistants and everybody else. If you say how many people are really actually working on floors manufacturing things, it's 5%, and that's in the range of where farming was within my lifetime. So the jobs aren't going to come there. The jobs are going to come in services, and the jobs are going to come in the services that are essential, but which it's much harder to drive productivity increases. You know what? Like, for as long as there's a world, it's going to take one kindergarten teacher 1 hour to provide 12 children instruction in kindergarten in a class of 12. And productivity increases is called larger class sizes. It's the same thing. And what I think we haven't really come to grips with at all as a society is that the stuff that isn't experiencing structural productivity increases is stuff that's fundamentally important, like health and education, and is stuff that's disproportionately associated with the public sector or the nonprofit sector. And the things that are really all about capitalism, really, in the traditional sense, really are working spectacularly well. We're getting more and more manufactured goods. Incredible. I mean, if you look at the appliances that an average poverty line family has. They are much better than the appliances that the average American had 35 or 40 years ago. So it's not really about making manufacturing better. It's about how you handle the future of these sectors where the projected job growth is going to come from, and where there are all these complicated issues of how they fit with the public sector. And I think that's going to be the great challenge for our economics and politics going forward. I was always very mindful of the fact that the BLS's projections of where the jobs are going to come from in the next decade think that healthcare is the leading sector, and healthcare is the only sector where it's a generally agreed objective of public policy to shrink its growth. And there's some irony there that really does, I think, require reflection.
Good. I have two more questions to ask, and then let's go to the floor. One is a broad question, and the other is more personal. China, you mentioned that as a third sort of area of deep concern. Graham has been, going with a group of scholars, American scholars, to China periodically, and has been back and forth. And I gather from comments Graham once made when Joe Nye and I were present, they've been talking about Thucydides and what they call the Thucydides trap. And it's a line from Thucydides about why the Peloponnesian Wars. And he wrote, "What made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta." Are we Sparta in this situation?
We Sparta, or we? I think we like to think of ourselves as being Athens.
Well, yeah, we do.
rather than
But the power that's growing.
rather than as being Sparta. I think it's not easy to argue that to this point, Chinese behaviors are heavily driven by what they see as our excessive assertiveness. There was a whole tradition of observation during the Cold War that sought to excuse Russian behavior by explaining that it was a consequence of overly aggressive misjudgments in the United States. And certainly there were things said in the United States about the size of the missile gap during the 1960 presidential campaign that don't look to have been very accurate in retrospect. But I think a fair reading of what drove Soviet decision-making, what drove Soviet assertiveness, was much more a set of internal factors. So I would not accept the critique that some kind of U.S. expansionism or the threat of U.S. expansionism is the way to understand what's going on in China and is the way to understand things that may be happening in China that we find problematic. At a broader level, I think that what Graham talked about, what others have talked about when they talk about the Thucydides trap, is that history records that when there are rapidly rising powers whose relative strength is changing quite quickly, the system is more likely to accommodate that awkwardly and badly than to accommodate it easily and well. We think of ourselves in the United States as a highly benign example, but that would perhaps not be the view in the Caribbean or in the Philippines or in a variety of Native American communities or at an earlier point in Mexico. And we are probably the most positive example. And the rate of change in relative power, relative economic strength in China is greater than it ever was with us and Britain by a very substantial margin. So it is going to take a great deal of thoughtful management on both sides. And I think it's going to require a kind of effort on our part to invest in understanding China that I am not sure we fully make as a country. Every time I go to China, I am struck by the sophistication of the questions that I am asked about American politics. And I'm very much aware that I'm not in a position, and I don't think many of my friends are in a position to ask comparably sophisticated questions about precisely what is going on with respect to Chinese politics. But both of our nations have a staggering stake in managing this well. We are separated by very large physical physical distances, and I think a great deal of intellectual effort is going on in both societies to manage these transitions as well as they possibly can be managed. I do think we in the United States do have a tendency about once a decade to decide that there's a country that's more disciplined than we are, that invests more than we do, that has a stronger public sector than we do, that is more committed to having a national strategy as distinct from decentralization than we do, has lots more engineers than we do, and have lots fewer lawyers than we do, and is soon going to surpass us. John Kennedy died believing that Russia would surpass the United States by 1985. Every issue of the Harvard Business Review in 1990 contained some version of the joke that the Cold War is over and Germany and Japan had won. Henry Kissinger crafted the détente policy on the basis of a view that the constellation of forces was fundamentally moving against the United States. And today we have this, Ezra Vogel wrote a book about Japan as number one. And today we have this tremendous apprehension about China. And I think it would be helpful for Americans to be a bit more appreciative of the fundamental resilience of our system and a bit more aware that systems that are more dirigiste and driven have a tendency to be good when they're good, but have a tendency to not stay good indefinitely. And I don't think the Chinese are as confident about linear extrapolation of their future as many in the United States are about linear extrapolation of their future.
I know Joe and I would applaud everything you just said vigorously. There'll be a chance. I'd like to invite you to start lining up the microphone so we can go to the floor. And as you do, I want to ask one last question here, a personal question. Larry, among your many, the long trail of things that might be written and said about you, one that's most recent, I think you're the only person I've ever heard of who is not an actor, who has had a prominent role in 2 films which got the Academy Awards the same night. One was The Social Network, and the other was Inside Job. You probably were happier with one than the other, but I'm just curious about how you felt about them.
I liked Inside Job better than I liked, I liked Social Network better than I liked Inside Job. I'm told that the Winklevi, when asked about the movie, said it's fairly accurate, except Larry Summers was not nearly that nice to us in person as he was in the movie. I've read in 1 or 2 places that I can on occasion be arrogant, and if that is so, I probably was on the occasion of my visit with the Winklevi, but I decided that Harvard's student discipline procedures were vexed enough without taking a role in intellectual property disputes among different students. Inside Job, well, the first thing to say is that I only wish, and my children even more wish, that the estimates of my financial position in that movie were remotely close to being correct. And that is not the only egregious error of fact that is contained in that movie. But look, it points up a real issue, and it's an issue that's not unrelated to your comments about the business community. And I'll choose a sector remote from what I do. It is very hard to find people who are deeply knowledgeable about nuclear reactors who have never been paid by anybody who has anything to do with a nuclear reactor. Because why would you actually be spending all your time on nuclear reactors if you weren't working for a company that had something to do with a nuclear reactor, or working in a university in nuclear engineering? And who funds nuclear engineering programs in universities? It tends to be people who have something to do with nuclear things. And so there is a real deep problem for the society as it becomes more technical and more expert, which is that it's very hard to find disinterested expertise, and it's very hard to have complete confidence in interested expertise. And that's the basic dilemma that Inside Job goes to town on. That's the basic reason why President Obama insisted on much more transparency for all of us who worked for him, and much more post-employment restriction than any other president has had. That's why I felt it was appropriate when I was here during the period when I was writing my FT columns to always talk about the affiliation I had with the financial institution when I wrote those columns. There's a real concern here. On the other hand, we have to think very hard about having nuclear policy made by people who've never really had contact with the nuclear industry. And that kind of issue exists in many, many different places. And so it's a very hard question.
Good. That's very helpful. It's very helpful. Why don't we go to the floor? We'll start here, go here. The NI rules that one question per customer. Please make it brief. And remember that, please identify yourself. And remember that a question ends with a question mark. You're here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Summers. First of all, I just wanted to repeat David's question, what you consider to be your shortcomings or failure during the crisis, and then about market failures. If you mentioned this analysis of sort of appliances at 10 versus healthcare costs at 700. I suspect if you look at the sort of the three most expensive thing in that basket would probably be energy, healthcare, and financial services, the three sort of biggest market failures we've had during this last 20 years. And the inability of the government to really sort of cope with that and deal with that. And how can an elected official actually do something to sort of reform these sort of market failures if they're being financed by the biggest source of campaign financing happens to coincide with these three areas?
Well, President Obama did succeed in passing. You can argue about whether it was a good bill or whether it was a bad bill, but he did pass the most far-reaching healthcare reform bill in 40 years. He did succeed in passing the most far-reaching financial reform bill in 50 or 60 years over the opposition of many lobbyists in the financial industry. So I think one has to be a little more careful than I think many are about assuming that our democracy doesn't work. I spent a year as a child in England in the late 1960s. And in England, they really had a terrific system. The prime minister was always of the same party as the parliament, as the majority in the parliament, and so they really got along. Really, the prime minister could really drive things. He could really get things done, and they did get things done. 3 times in the post-war period, they nationalized steel, and 3 times in the post-war period, they privatized steel. Well, I kind of think having some more checks and balances that maybe sludge things up has something to do with why we're still operating with the same political system that we had 200 years ago, and almost nobody else is.
Good, please.
Hi, I'm John Soilo, a freshman at the college. I'm also a member of the new media committee of the forum committee here. So in addition to promoting the forum on Facebook and live tweeting, we receive questions online. A friend of mine who couldn't make it tonight, Philip Acevedo, who's also an undergrad at the college, wanted me to ask you the following question. In the early 2000s, you defended deregulation, as far as I know, and how do you view this issue in light of the financial crisis? How do you think your views changed, or maybe it didn't, in terms of the deregulation of financial markets?
I don't think it's actually helpful to say all regulation is good or all deregulation is good. I think you have to look at particular regulations. There were two sets of issues that I was involved in not actually in the 2000s. In the 2000s, I was doing Harvard politics, not Washington politics. But in the late 1990s, one involved so-called Glass-Steagall and the combination of banks and investment banks. I don't think there's any evidence that the combining of banks and investment banks related to this financial crisis. For one thing, while we passed that reform in 1999, there were no transactions, zero, that took place between 1999 and 2008 that wouldn't have been legal under previous law. For another, once we got into the crisis, a set of those changes actually facilitated and enabled a better response with respect to the investment banks. And the country that's generally regarded as having had the safest and most stable financial system, Canada, has a system of universal banking where the banks have always been combined with the investment banks. So I think that set of measures actually was probably a positive contribution. I think there are more questions that you can ask about the rules with respect to futures and derivatives. At the time, credit default swaps essentially didn't exist. And so the issues that people were discussing when they talked about derivatives were a rather different set of issues, and those issues actually haven't surfaced as important problems over the next decade. Would it have been better if we had foreseen a set of things that we didn't foresee? Absolutely. Would I take the position today, knowing everything that I know now, that I took in 2000 with the gift of prescience? Absolutely not. As Keynes said when somebody pointed out that he had changed his mind about something, when I see new evidence, I change my mind, and you. Yeah. And so would I like to have been able to look back and foreseen that I had advocated all the things that are contained in the financial reforms that were recently passed in 1999? Yeah, I would like to do that, and I certainly can't claim that. On the other hand, we did push very hard for reforms of predatory lending, and the Republican Congress wouldn't even deign to discuss the issue, and that was central to the financial crisis. I did, as Treasury Secretary at some political peril, raise a set of questions about the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which proved to be important contributors to the crisis. So they're things that I look back on with more of a sense of satisfaction, like with the benefit of hindsight, I would have done exactly the same thing. And there are other things where I surely would have done something different if I had known everything that I know now. But I think as a country, we'll make more progress on all of this if we try to avoid broad general labels and we try to talk about issues on an issue-by-issue basis. And I think one of the things that's most distressing in academic communities is when things become heavily politicized. You know, to take an example outside my field, if you look at physicists, there are a fair number of physicists who are always for arms control and are worried about the safety of nuclear power plants. And there are other physicists who think nuclear power plants are, who are safe, and who think you got to be very careful about arms control treaties because you don't trust the other guys. And there's almost nobody in the other two boxes. And yet, if you think about it as a matter of logic, there's no reason why the issues are terribly linked. And so I think we would do well in general to avoid labels like regulation and deregulation, and instead try to focus on a variety of specific judgments.
Please.
So first off, thank you very much, Mr. Summers. So my question is, given that you don't see much of a future for manufacturing in the U.S., and your predictions about service sector job growth were also perhaps a little grim, how do you tackle high levels of unemployment, especially amongst people who are unskilled or at lower wage levels in the economy?
I think you have to think very hard about, I think there's some things that are relatively easy. Look, not because it's the most important sector, but because it's one of the most visible for people like the people in this room. Go to Kennedy Airport, look around Kennedy Airport, get on a plane from Kennedy Airport to almost any foreign destination you can fly from Kennedy Airport, and I don't think you'll think Kennedy Airport looks very good in comparison. And that is saying something that's true about a great deal of American infrastructure. If a moment when the government can borrow money for 30 years, fairly close to 4% in its own currency, and when the unemployment rate for construction workers is close to 20%, if that is not a moment when it would be a good idea to step up our efforts at investment in infrastructure, I can't imagine what would be a better moment to invest in infrastructure. I think that's one part of the answer. Second part of the answer goes to education and training, and we are just headed into a world where it's going to be more about what your mind can do and less about what your hands can do than it has been historically. And we don't have an education system that's fully adapted to that. And third, we need to think about the future of those service sectors and how we can grow them. And part of that is recognizing that they are something that is very, very important as well. But let's remember that every time a job is created, spending is created. Every time spending takes place, a job is created. And so we're not quite going to make ourselves so productive that there aren't any jobs anymore, because if we're so productive, we're going to be in a position to spend a lot, and that's going to operate to create jobs.
Please.
My name is Ping Zhao. I'm working at Harvard Observatory. I want to ask your opinion about the talk of Chinese government manipulating its currency. In a free economy, how can one country, we the United States, economic growth depend on another country's currency policy? This thing doesn't happen between any other two countries.
Well, actually, it happens between countries all the time. I mean, as long as there's been monies in different countries, there have been discussions of what the exchange rates are and what the effect of them are. There were many, many discussions of the value of the yen and how that affected the sale of Japanese products in the United States. So there's nothing that's new about it. There were many, many different discussions of the value of the pound and how it affects the sale of British products in Europe, and it's not hard to see why. When a currency moves, that changes the relative cost when the country with that currency tries to export its products. And so it's natural that it do that. The reason why the Chinese currency occasions such concern is that it's not being set by market forces. It's not that the government is allowing it to fluctuate freely in the market, but the government is in fact intervening in the marketplace on a substantial scale to put that currency at a certain level. And the consequence of that action is to make it much harder for many American producers to sell goods in China and to make it much easier for Chinese producers to sell goods in the United States. And that's why the question of the currency has been a substantial concern, not just for the United States, but most recently for French President Sarkozy, as he and the majority of the G20 countries as they prepare for their annual meeting.
Please.
Yeah, my name is Nasif Hazal. I'm a lecturer in the local university. Before you went to the White House as an economic advisor, I believe, according to New York Times, that you have written some articles on efficiency of markets. And after you had your finger on the pulse of the economy during the recession and recovery of the recession, what do you think about that now?
Well, I wrote papers that argued that financial markets were not efficient if what was meant by efficiency was accurately valuing future prospects, that they had a substantial tendency towards excess volatility, to move in large swings, that markets were heavily affected by what we called in our work noise traders. And certainly those ideas have been confirmed. I've been reinforced in those ideas by the events of the last couple of years. I don't think anyone should suppose that market prices are consistently right as a forecast of the future. On the other hand, I think that one needs to be very careful of supposing that political figures in authority have a better idea of where prices should be or what assets should be worth than do markets. In some ways, there's a great deal about markets that fits Winston Churchill's famous dictum about democracy, that it's the worst available system except for all the alternatives.
Yeah. We'll try to cover these last three questions that are on the floor now, and then we'll call it a night. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Kotaro Tamura. I'm currently with the US-Japan program at Harvard. And before coming here, I was a Japanese politician in the upper house, and I was a parliamentary secretary for fiscal planning and economic planning. So we are in trouble. We need your help. We are suffering from disaster. And in the wake of the disaster, our economy is shrinking, starts shrinking again. And our economy is in stagnant for 2 decades. And our fiscal difficulties is the number one in the human history. And our demography shrinking and aging. So suppose you are appointed as a Japanese economic policy advisor, so what will be the first step? Do you think, for example, financing through BOJ, the government spending, do you think it's a good idea?
Oh, look, I think the most important thing that can happen in Japan right now is that the government can mount as an effective, a strong disaster relief program as possible. And that's where, it seems to me, any effort has to start. I think the dangers of deflation and slowdown in Japan significantly exceed the dangers of excessive inflation. And so I think the errors in monetary policy probably should be on the side of expansion rather than on the side of contraction, and that there has been a tendency in Japan to lose sight of the seriousness of the deflation risk and to declare a return to normality prematurely over the last 20 years, and that has been a contributor to some of the difficulties that Japan's had.
Please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Michael Beal. I was a 06 graduate of the college in class of 2012 from the business school. I was hoping that we could speak a little bit about state and local governments. Obviously, during the stimulus, some of the Build for America funds didn't flow through to the actual contractors because it was offset and sapped up by the issues that were going on in state and local governments. President Obama in his 2012 budget has proposed expanding the BAB bonds, and I was hoping that we could get some of your impacts in terms of where we stand with state and local governments and how that will affect the sustained recovery of the, or sustained prolonging of the recovery and going forward.
The Build America bonds are a particular device that instead of allowing state and local governments to issue tax-free debt, enable them to issue taxable debt and then get a subsidy of 35%, which for a variety of reasons is probably an advantageous thing to do, and it's too bad they weren't more fully extended than they were. In general, it was my view over the time I advised President Obama that from an economic point of view, there was a lot to be said for support for state and local governments. The promptest form of fiscal expansion you can deliver is to prevent something from being cut back that otherwise was intended. And that rather than trying to design new kinds of spending, simply protecting existing spending was probably a good idea, particularly when that meant keeping schools open 5 days a week, avoiding the layoffs of teachers and the like. So I was a strong proponent of assistance to state and local governments, and I think, if anything, I would wish that we had done more of it in the past and that we were going to do more of it in the future. Politically, the idea of one part of government providing funds to another part of government so that government can continue to function is, shall we say, not an overwhelming political success in this climate. And so it was a difficult case to make politically. And as the tone of your question suggests, there were some issues of leakages. It was great when additional assistance permitted a state and local government to keep a school open that it otherwise wouldn't have kept open. It was more problematic when assistance to a state and local government enabled it to not dip into the rainy day fund in the midst of the worst rainy day in 30 or 40 years. It was not so attractive to us when, and this is the way politics works, when our support enabled a Republican governor to condemn our support as coming from the big spending Democrats and then use the money to cut taxes in his state. So making state and local assistance work in the way we would like it to was not without some challenges. But on balance, I think it's a very large issue. At the same time, we spoke, David questioned me at some length and expressed some questions about the specificity of my answers on our rendezvous with destiny around the deficits. Whatever the problems at the federal level, some of those problems are that much more profound at the state and local level in a number of our states. And one of the things the federal government has to do is be careful by providing funds of simply delaying and deferring necessary adjustments.
Larry, to conclude, I'd like to circle back briefly to what Graham raised in the beginning, and that is about lessons you brought back to Harvard from your most recent Washington experience. What strikes me tonight is how much more optimistic you are about the system, about the country, than many Americans are. But I'm just curious if you might summarize what your main lessons.
Well, you have to remember that I'm one of the very few people who went to Washington to be in a less political environment than the one he came than the one he came from, and that may affect my view. David, one of the things that I had a chance to do in the time before I went to Washington, and to some extent while I was in Washington, I've had a good deal of opportunity to do since I left, is to travel around. I don't minimize our problems at all. But if I had to trade problems, would I trade our problems for the problems of Japan that this gentleman asked about? Would I trade our problems for the problems that European finance ministers are facing right now? Would I trade our problems for a society like China's, where standards of living are still, for all the progress they've made, on average somewhere where ours were at the beginning of the 20th century, and where there are the tremendous challenges that public officials have of maintaining some kind of continuity of the growth experience. So I suppose that for me, these judgments have to be made against some standard, and it seems to me that against the standard of other countries, against the standard of some of the challenges that this country has faced. The Depression and the Second World War are very obvious examples. We worry and we discussed the legitimacy of institutions. But, you know, within my lifetime, there were substantial numbers of students who were supporting the firebombing of offices at this university, with substantial numbers of people who taught at this university in support as well. And there was nothing unique about this at this university, which was in many ways better than the situation at many others. So every moment has a tendency to see its problems as unique. And I don't minimize ours at all, but I think if you judge them against the standard of either things that we have surmounted in the past or against the standard of the challenges that other countries face, ours appear to me to be quite manageable. And it doesn't seem to me, and I guess you're the one who leads a center on leadership, but it doesn't seem to me that pessimism is likely to be the best motivator for moving things forward. And so I think it's important to maintain a sense of confidence, especially when that sense of confidence is actually, I think, warranted by a reading of history.
Wonderful close. I think that I can speak on behalf of all of us here tonight to first thank you for your service to the country and to the world, and very warmly to welcome you back to Harvard. We're delighted you're here. Thank you.